Hey guys, this is Matt with 4x4 Ranch. Today we're going to be talking about the Ford beadlock capable wheels. The beadlock capable wheels come on the Broncos, the Raptors, and the Bronco Raptors. Today's example, we're going to be using our Bronco Raptor, and we're going to use our beadlock capable wheels, and we're going to switch over to an actual beadlock rings and make these an actual beadlocked wheel. So as you can see with the beadlock capable wheels, they have a beauty ring on them that comes from the factory. What we've done is we've already taken all the bolts out. When you take this beauty ring off, you can see that there's a machined lip on the inside here. What we're going to do to switch it over to our true beadlock is we're going to move the bead from the inside to the outside, and then we're going to use one of Ford's actual functional beadlock rings, and that is, the bead is going to sit right here and right along here. We're going to bolt this on in place, and we'll have a functioning beadlock wheel. So let's go over to the tire machine and start looking at this. All right, so the first step that we're going to want to do to make this an actual bead-locked wheel is we've already let the air out of the tires. We removed the valve cord to do that. We've already taken off the original bead, or the trim ring, beauty ring that comes with it. You just need a Torx and you need to take off all those bolts. There is a Loctite on there, so they're kind of tricky to get off. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to break the bead. We're going to use a tire machine because we can. So we're going to break the bead. Because we're not switching tires, we're actually just going to use the same tire. We're just moving to a beadlock, using the beadlock capability. We don't have to break the rear bead, so we're just going to break the front, leave the rear seated, and we're going to work with the front bead on the tire. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, and so the next step that we're going to do is we're going to move the bead from the inside of the rim to the outside. So if you look at this, you can see it a little bit better since we've broken the bead. It used to sit right here. We're going to pull it to the outside, so it's going to sit on this surface where the beauty ring was, and then we're going to put the new functional beadlock ring over it, and the bead is going to be pinched right inside there. So you can do this with spoons. But again, I've got the easy equipment, so I'm doing it the easy way. And now you can see this is sitting on the outside. And we're just going to grease this up. We're going to lube this, as the instructions say, so that when we slide this down, it's going to slide down there real easy, and then we have to put all the bolts in and go through the torque sequence. All right, so now we've added some tire lube to the inside of the wheel, so this will slide on a little bit smoother. Because it has to slide down past the bead, lube is really important on here. We're going to set the beauty ring on, or the beadlock ring on here, making sure that we line up one of the notches with the valve stem, otherwise we're going to have a hard time putting air in there. Once we get that lined up, make sure it seats on there nice, and then we're going to grab our box of hardware, the bolts, and we're going to want to use an anti-seize. So we're going to go through and we're going to put anti-seize on each one of the bolts, and then we're going to set them in here and start them by hand, and then we're going to follow the torque sequence that Ford says to torque these down properly. All right, so now that we've gotten all of our bolts in there, we need to go through the torque sequence. And Ford has got very good instructions on this. A couple tips that we found that make things easier is if you mark the wheel, we like to mark the wheel every 90 degrees so you can have just marks to figure out where you're at. When you're following the torque sequence, it's much easier to find, okay, I'm gonna go here, 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 then I'm gonna go to the second one, second. It's much easier to find your way through, otherwise it's very easy to get lost and confused. We recommend, of course, get a good torque wrench. You don't need a big 1/2-inch torque wrench because if you look at the torque specs, you only torque this to 11, then to 26, and then to 46 foot-pounds, so it doesn't take a lot of torque, but you want to make sure you've got a good quality torque wrench because we want to make sure we torque these things properly. Take your time, go through, torque them to the first torque amount, make sure everything's staying consistent, torque to the next level, and then torque to the final level to make sure that you've got everything seated properly. If you do this right, you shouldn't have any problems with them loosening up over time or any leaks that are going to come up. Now the next thing we're going to do is I'd like to show you how the Ford bead locks differ from the aftermarket bead locks that you'll see on other wheels. Now what I want to do is show you the difference between an aftermarket bead lock and the Ford bead lock that they have. So right here we've got a Dirty Life wheel that came off of Mike's Gladiator. We're putting bigger tires on that because, you know, apparently 38s aren't big enough. And this, as you can see, has got the same style bead lock rim where it's got 24 bolts that just bolt this down. But if you look at the bead lock ring, it's a very flat ring. So when you bolt this down, it's compressing. It's got actually a lot of traction on here, which is pretty cool, but it compresses the rim or the bead of the tire inside the ring, just like our Ford one does, except for it doesn't have a lip. So if we look at the Ford one, it has a lip that goes on the inside there. So the bead actually sits right here and all the way down. So this is touching the whole bead. And when you compress the Ford one down, it actually will go down to metal. So this metal is touching the rim, where this one is always metal, rubber, metal as you compress it. Because of that, the Dirty Life rims or any aftermarket wheels aren't able to use as much torque when you torque them down. So you're only going to torque these down to 26 foot-pounds of torque, where these torque down to 46 foot-pounds of torque. And because they're metal to metal, you're not going to have that fluctuation that's going to allow those bead lock bolts to loosen. So if it's metal on metal, it can flex a lot more and they'll be able to work themselves loose. With metal to metal, it's not going to move as much, so you should have less problems. So it's quite a bit different design. I personally think that the Ford ones are a little bit easier to work with and a little bit more solid, but that way you know what you're getting and how it's different. So one common question we get is, how come we only have a bead lock on the outside bead and not on the inside bead? So we've got one of our Dirty Life wheels here, and let's take a look at this wheel and it'll be obvious why it's important to have the first on the outside bead. So as you can see on the outside bead, it's got a very short bead surface here, and then it cuts in. And the reason why it cuts in is when you're removing the tire, you break the bead, you slide the tire in this on one side, and it gives us enough room to stretch the tire over the other side. Without this, it'd be extremely difficult to mount tires. So the outside bead has got a very short bead surface. If it slides off this, there's a big gap, it lets out all the air, you're immediately done. On the inside bead, on almost any wheel, there's a very large bead surface. So even if it slides in a ways, it's still going to be sealed because it's tight. So this large bead surface allows it to move around without losing air. And then they typically have a lip. This Dirty Life wheel has got a really nice lip here that you can see will help hold that bead so it can't push past that. So it's really unlikely that you're going to break an inner bead compared to an outer bead. The other advantage of having one side locked is that if you do break an inner bead, but the other side is locked on there and can't slip, it's much easier to reset that bead because the tire is being held in place perfectly. So that's why there are certain wheels that will lock both, but it's very common to only lock the outside bead because that is where you typically have the problems.